Of the 60 or more men who conspired to murder Julius Caesar, not one died peacefully. Not one died of old age, in his own bed, surrounded by family. History records that they called themselves the Liberatores, the Liberators. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, they plunged their daggers into the most powerful man in the world, believing they were saving the Roman Republic from a tyrant. They were wrong. They hadn't saved the Republic. They had just signed its death warrant, and their own. They believed the act of killing one man would restore freedom. They never planned for what came next. They never planned for the roar of the Roman people. And they certainly never planned for two men who would unleash a tide of vengeance so vast it would drown them all. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Octavian, his 19-year-old grandnephew and adopted heir. This is not the story of an assassination. This is the story of a reckoning. This is how every senator who stabbed Julius Caesar died. This is Rome's revenge. The conspiracy was led by two men, Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius was the true mastermind, a practical, bitter man who despised tyranny in all its forms. He had a personal hatred for Caesar. Brutus was the idealist, the noble Roman. He was convinced, seduced even, by the idea that his own ancestor had expelled the last king of Rome. He was told it was his destiny to do the same. And here lies the first great irony. To save the Republic, Brutus murdered the man who was perhaps his greatest friend and benefactor. Caesar had personally pardoned Brutus after they fought on opposite sides in a previous civil war. Caesar had promoted him, trusted him. Brutus repaid that trust with a dagger, but their fatal error wasn't the murder itself. It was the planning, or lack thereof, for the aftermath. Brutus, in his noble idealism, made two catastrophic mistakes. First, Cassius wanted to kill Mark Antony alongside Caesar. Brutus refused. He argued that killing Caesar was a sacrifice to the Republic, not a bloody purge. Killing Antony, he said, would make them look like common murderers. This single act of mercy would be their doom. Second, they had no plan for the day after. They killed the dictator, walked out of the Senate, and nothing. They expected the Republic to magically restore itself. They completely misread the mood of the people who had grown to love Caesar and his generosity. At Caesar's funeral, that mercy came back to haunt them. Mark Antony, the man Brutus spared, stepped before the crowd. With masterful oratory, he held up Caesar's bloody, torn toga. He read Caesar's will, a will that left vast fortunes and gardens to the very people of Rome. He turned the assassins from liberators into traitors in a single speech. The crowd exploded. A wave of fury washed over Rome. Mobs hunted for the conspirators who were forced to flee the city they thought they had just saved. Meanwhile, a new player entered the game. Octavian, a teenager. But he wasn't just any boy. He was Caesar's son. Adopted, yes, but he carried the one name that mattered more than any other. Octavian, Antony, and a general named Lepidus formed the second triumvirate. Their goal was not to save the Republic. It was to avenge Caesar and seize power for themselves. Their first act, a calculated, cold-blooded purge. The prescriptions. They drew up a death list of their enemies. 300 senators and 2,000 knights. Anyone on the list was an outlaw. They could be killed by anyone, their property seized. This was Rome's first taste of organized revenge. The great orator Cicero, though not a conspirator, was put on the list by Antony for his sharp-tongued speeches. He was caught trying to escape. His head and hands were cut off and, in a gruesome display, nailed to the very speaker's podium in the Roman Forum where he had so often spoken against Antony. The message was clear: there would be no mercy. The vengeance hunt began, and the fates of the assassins were uniquely, brutally ironic. One of the first to fall was Gaius Trebonius. His role on the Ides of March was crucial. He was the one who distracted Mark Antony, luring him outside the Senate so the others could do their work. A year later, while serving as governor in Asia, he was captured by a loyal Caesarian general. He wasn't given a trial. He was tortured for an entire day, then beheaded. His head was impaled on a spike and paraded through the city. The man who distracted Antony from the violence was met with the most prolonged, sadistic violence of all. Then there was Decimus Brutus. Do not confuse him with Marcus Brutus. Decimus was, ironically, one of Caesar's closest and most trusted friends. Caesar had named Decimus in his will, second only to Octavian. He was, for all intents and purposes, like a son. When Caesar was hesitant to go to the Senate on the Ides of March, it was Decimus who personally went to his home and convinced him to go, laughing off the bad omens. After the assassination, Decimus tried to flee to Gaul. His own troops, sensing the changing political tide, deserted him. He was left a fugitive, wandering in disguise. He was captured by a Gallic chieftain, a man who owed his position to Julius Caesar. The chieftain, seeing which way the wind was blowing, sent a message to Mark Antony. The reply was simple: kill him. Decimus Brutus, a high-born Roman aristocrat, was dragged into a muddy hut and unceremoniously beheaded. The ultimate frenemy, betrayed by all, His death was as pathetic and degrading as his betrayal was personal. But the main architects, Brutus and Cassius, were still at large. They had fled to the east, where they amassed a massive army, 19 legions. They were the last, best hope of the old republic. In 42 BC, Antony and Octavian crossed the sea to face them. The fate of the world would be decided at Philippi, in northern Greece. The death of Cassius. The first battle of Philippi was a chaotic, brutal brawl. Mark Antony, a brilliant soldier, smashed through Cassius's lines. Cassius's legions broke and fled. Cassius himself retreated to a nearby hill, his vision poor, his spirit broken. From that hill, he saw a cloud of dust in the distance. Cavalry. He saw them ride towards his camp and surround his personal tent-bearer. He believed it was Antony's forces, that the battle was lost, and that his best friend, Titinius, had been captured. "I have lived," he muttered, "to see my best friend taken before my very eyes." Consumed by despair, Cassius ordered his personal slave, Pindarus, to kill him. Pindarus, obeying a long-standing oath, drew his sword and plunged it into his master. Here is the tragedy, the unbearable irony. The cavalry was not the enemy. It was Brutus's cavalry. On the other side of the battlefield, Brutus had actually won. He had smashed Octavian's legions and overrun his camp. The horsemen Cassius saw were Brutus's men, riding to tell Cassius the good news. The man they surrounded, Titinius, was not being captured. He was being cheered. Cassius, the pragmatist, the man who saw the world for what it was, died because of a fatal misunderstanding. He died on a false report. When Brutus found his body, he wept. "The last of all the Romans," he called him, the death of Brutus. 3 weeks later, the Second Battle of Philippi was fought. Brutus was now in sole command, but his heart was not in it. His troops were demoralized. Legend says he was haunted. The night before the battle, the ghost of Caesar himself appeared in his tent, a vast, shadowy figure. "Who are you?" Brutus demanded. "I am thy evil spirit, Brutus. Thou shalt see me at Philippi." The battle was a slaughter. Antony and Octavian's forces were relentless. Brutus's army was shattered. He fled into the dark hills with a few remaining friends. He knew it was over. The Republic was dead. His ideals were a sham. He sat exhausted and quoted a Greek text. "O wretched virtue, thou wert but a name, and yet I worship thee as real." He could not bear to be captured, to be paraded through Rome in chains by Octavian. He asked his friends, one by one, to kill him. They all refused. Finally, he turned to his servant, Strato. He asked Strato to hold his sword steady. Brutus grabbed the hilt, steadied the point against his own chest, and ran onto the blade. The noble Brutus, the man who had delivered the most famous cut of all, died by his own hand, on his own sword. The very weapon that had been raised to save Rome now only served to end its savior's life in the mud of a foreign field. Antony, finding his body, showed a rare moment of grace. He ordered Brutus's body wrapped in his own most expensive purple cloak, recognizing that Brutus, alone among the conspirators, had acted not from envy or hatred, but from a misguided, tragic sense of honor. Philippi was the end of the war, but it was not the end of the revenge. Octavian, in particular, was merciless. He had no patience for honor. He was cold, calculating, and he kept a list. Dozens of other conspirators, the second stringers, were still alive. Their fates were a grim catalogue of violence. Casca, the man who struck the first blow against Caesar, died at Philippi. Servius Galba, another, was ambushed and murdered by his own soldiers. Pontius Aquila also died at Philippi. The Ligarius brothers, hunted down. Minucius Basileus, murdered by his own slaves whom he had brutally mutilated. A fitting end for a cruel master. One by one, they were picked off. Some died in naval battles, fighting against Octavian's admirals. Some were captured and executed without trial. Some, seeing the end, simply fell on their own swords, as Brutus and Cassius had. The triumvirate's agents scoured the known world. No one was safe, no one was forgiven. And then there was one. For 14 years, one last assassin remained, Cassius Parmensis. He was one of the minor conspirators. He had fled Rome, fought at Philippi, and escaped. He had fled to Sicily and escaped again. He had joined Mark Antony in his final war against Octavian, and when Antony was defeated, Parmensis fled again. He was the last man on the list. He fled to Athens, Greece, trying to live in obscurity as a writer. But Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, the first Roman emperor, did not forget. In 30 BC, almost 15 years after the Ides of March, an executioner sent by Augustus found Cassius Parmensis in Athens. He was dragged from his study and killed. The last drop of blood required by Caesar's ghost had finally been spilled. The final and most profound irony is this. The liberatores murdered one man to save the Republic, but their act did not save it. It destroyed it. The 14 years of brutal civil war that followed Caesar's death ripped the old Republic apart at the seams. It killed an entire generation of its leaders. And who emerged from the wreckage? Octavian, Augustus, Caesar's heir. The man who finished the hunt. The man who would rule Rome with more absolute power than Julius Caesar had ever dreamed of. The conspirators set out to prevent a king. Their actions created an emperor. They stabbed Caesar 23 times. But in the end, it was their own ideals, their own ambitions, and their own lives that bled out on the floor of history. Rome's revenge was total, and it was absolute.